Do, do, do. Da, 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 da. All right, let's lighten up. There we go. Like it's working. All right. So, if you've tuned in before, you've seen these before. We are doing the Federalist Papers. These are the fundamental backgrounds to everything in the Constitution. The founding fathers didn't just write the Constitution and said figure it out. They wrote dozens of essays, especially Hamilton and Jay. They wrote all these things. They were going, hey, because they had to. They had to defend the Constitution because the states had to ratify it. They had to go, hey, this is the thing that we're doing. So this is why we are doing it. So they wrote the Federalist Papers to defend the Constitution and to explain the Constitution, explain the thought process behind the Constitution, explains why it's written that way, and they did this thing or not everything. Why? Okay, TikTok is yelling at me because I am apparently using copywritten things. This is public domain TikTok. This is a historical document. I don't know how this is it's a historical document. I don't know how this. All right. Well, we'll keep going. I might have to restart the stream if it keeps acting weird. But all right, we're going to go on. Start off with Federalist number 69. This is a Hamilton one. So we just got through all the Senate ones and the House of Representatives ones. So this is his defense of Article 3, the executive branch and all the things the executive branch and why they gave the powers to the executive branch that they did and the checks on the executive branch. The real character of the executive, 1788. I proceed now to trace the real characters of this proposed executive as they are marked out in the plan of the convention. This will serve as a strong light the unfairness of the representations which have been made in regard to it. So he's all these people that are complaining about the Constitution. There's also other people writing other pamphlets and things telling the states, hey, we probably shouldn't ratify it for this, or this reason. So in a lot of these papers, he's addressing and counteracting or counter arguing the arguments against the Constitution. The first thing which strikes our attention is that the executive authority, with few exceptions, is to be vested in a single magistrate. This will scarcely, however, be considered as a point upon which any comparison can be grounded, for it is in particular there to be a resemblance to the King of Great Britain. There is not less resemblance to the Grand Signator than the Khan of Tartary, or the Man of the Seven Mountains, or to the Governor of New York. The magistrate is to be elected for, all caps, 4 years, and is to be re-electable as often as the people of the United States shall think him worthy of their confidence. This was changed after FDR. People were like, all right, maybe twice is enough. In these circumstances, there is a total dissimilitude between him and a king of Great Britain, who is their hereditary monarch, possessing the crown patrimonially, this is sensible to his heirs forever. But there is a close analogy between him and the Governor of New York, who is elected for 3 years and is re-eligible without limitation or intermission. All right, so he's going to compare the differences by comparing the King of Great Britain to the Governor of New York. If we consider how much less time it would be requisite for establishing the dangers and influences in a single state than for establishing a like influence through the United States, we must conclude that the duration of 4 years for the Chief Magistrate of the Union is a degree of permanency far less to be dreaded in office than a duration of 3 years for corresponding office in a single state. the President of the United States would be liable to be impeached, tried, and upon conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes or misdemeanors, removed from office. You'll often hear this quote not quite finished. Okay, I guess I gotta restart this live because it's yelling at me for... It's a Word document. So what is the issue? What if I delete that? Just do that. All right. Continuing where I left off before. He's yelling at me for copyright materials, even though it's a public domain and even a Word document. All right. The President of the United States should be liable to impeach, tried upon conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes or misdemeanors. I don't know if they go into it in this one, but he does describe examples of high crimes and misdemeanors. But treason, bribery, all these things are convictable for the president. It's not, just treason. It can't, if he does a crime, Congress has to do it. The House of Representatives and the Senate has to do it, but the president can be tried for these things. Removed from office and would afterward be liable for prosecution and punishment in the ordinary course of law. Okay. What? Okay, I just have to give up on that. I just can't stream that. Or on there. All right. Give it one more shot. We're giving up on that. All right. So after the Senate and the House of Representatives can impeach, punish, kick out of office, then they're liable for that crime. The government can just go and convict them, and they can't be pardoned for it. The person of the King of Great Britain is sacred and inviolable, and there is no constitutional tribunal to which he is amenable, no punishment to which he can be subjugated without involving the crisis of national revolution. In this delicate and important circumstances of personal responsibility, the President of Confederate America would stand upon no better ground than the Governor of New York, and upon worse ground than the governors of Maryland or Delaware. So this is one thing that the founders, they really did think that impeachment would be a lot more common than it ended up being. They thought, people would be being kicked out of office. They didn't think it was going to be this taboo thing that would never happen, and it would just be this rare and obscure circumstance. They thought that presidents, senators, and stuff, they thought that would be like, it wouldn't happen often, but it would be kind of a regular thing of, people being impeached. All right. The President of the United States has no power to return a bill to which shall have been passed the two branches of the legislature for reconsideration, and the bill is so returned to become law. If upon that reconsideration it is to be approved by 2/3 of both houses, the King of Great Britain, on his part, has absolute negative upon the acts of the two houses of Parliament. The disuse of that power for considerable time past has not affected the reality of its existence, and is to be ascribed wholly to the Crown's having found the means of substituting influence to authority, or the art of gaining the majority in one or the other of the two houses, to the necessity of exerting a prerogative which seldom be exerted without hazarding some degree of national agitation. The qualified negative of president differs widely from the absolute negative of the British sovereign, and this tallies exactly with the revisionary authority of the Council of Revision of this state. Speaking of, he's comparing this to the government of New York at the time. A lot of the Constitution was based off the constitutions of the states, which most of them had written their constitutions before the United States had written its constitution, of which the governor is a constituent part. In this respect, the power of the president would exceed that of the governor of New York, because the former would possess singly what the latter shares with the chancellor and judges, but it would be precisely the same with that of the governor of Massachusetts, whose constitution, as this article seems to have been, the original from which the convention has copied. The president is to be the commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy of the United States, and of the militia of the several states. When called into the actual service of the United States, he is to have the power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment, to recommend this to the consideration of Congress, such measures as he shall judge necessary and expedient to convene on extraordinary occasions. Both houses of legislature, or either of them, in cases of disagreement between them, with respect to the time of adjournment. The to adjourn them is in such times as he shall think proper. They thought there was going to be a lot of like this mattering a lot of the adjournment of Congress, but it didn't end up being like a big deal that too often in history. To take care that the laws be faithfully executed and to the commission of all officers of the United States. In most of these particulars, the power of the president will resemble equally that of the King of Britain and of the governor of New York. The most material points of difference are these. First, the president will only have the occasional command of such a part of the militia of the nation as by legislative provision. I will repeat that for modern times. The president will only have the occasional command of such part of the militia of the nation as by the legislative provision may be called into the actual service of the Union. The King of Great Britain, on the other hand, and the governor of New York have at all times the entire command of the militia within their several jurisdictions. In this article, therefore, the power of the president should be inferior to that either of the monarch or the governor. I will read that again for modern listeners. In this article, therefore, the president would be inferior to either the monarch or the governor. Secondly, the president is to be the commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy of the United States. In this respect, his authority would nominally be the same as that of Great Britain, but in substance much inferior to it. It would amount to nothing more than the supreme command and direction of the military and naval forces, as the first general and admiral of the Confederacy, while that of the British king extends that to declaring of war and to the raising and regulating of fleets and armies. All which, by the Constitution under consideration, would appertain to the legislation. The governor of New York, on the other hand, is by the Constitution of the state vested only with the command of the militia and the navy, but the constituents of several of the states expressly declare their governors to be commanders-in-chief as well of the army and navy, and it may well be a question whether those of New Hampshire and Massachusetts in particular do not in this instance confer larger powers upon their respective governors than could be claimed as a president of the United States. Thirdly, the power of the president in respect to pardons would extend in all cases except those of impeachment The governor of New York may pardon in all cases, even those of impeachment, except for treason and murder. It is not the powers of the governor in this article on a calculation of political consequences greater than that of the president. All conspiracies and plots against the government, which have not been matured into actual treason, may be screened from punishment of every kind by the interposition of the prerogative of pardoning. If a governor of New York, therefore, should be at the head of any such conspiracy, until the design has been ripened into actual hostility, he could ensure his accomplices and adherents an entire impunity. All right, so that's what a governor could do with the power of impeachment. What do they think a president can do with the power of a pardon? A president of the Union, on the other hand, though he may even pardon treason when prosecuted in the ordinary course of law, could shelter no offender in any degree from the effects of impeachment and conviction. Would not the prospect of total indemnity for all the preliminary steps be greater temptation to undertake and preserve in an enterprise against the public liberty than that of mere prospect of an exemption from the death of confiscation if the final execution of design upon an actual appeal of arms should miscarry? Would this last expectation have any influence at all when the probability was computed that the person who was to afford that exemption might himself be involved in the consequences of the measure, and might be incapacitated by his agency in affording the desired impunity? The better to judge of this matter, it will be necessary to recollect that the proposed Constitution, the offense of treason, is limited to levying war upon the United States, adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort, and that by the laws of New York is to be confined within similar bounds. Fourthly, the President can only adjourn the national legislature in a single case of disagreement. About the time of adjournment, the British monarch may prorogue or even dissolve the Parliament. The governor of New York may also prorogue the legislature of the state for a limited time, a power which, in certain situations, may be employed to very important purposes. The President is to have power, with the advice and consent of the Senate, to make treaties, provided 2/3 of the senators' presence occur. So you can't go and make a deal without 2/3 of the Senate to concur. 2/3. No deal in this last year has reached that threshold. The King of Great Britain is the sole and absolute representative of the nation in all foreign transactions. He can, of his own accord, make treaties of peace, commerce, alliance, and every other description. It has been insinuated that his authority in this respect is not conclusive, and that his conventions with foreign powers are subject to revision, and stand in need of the ratification of Parliament. But I believe this doctrine was never heard of until it was broached upon the present occasion. Every jurist of that kingdom, and every other man acquainted with its constitution, knows this as an established fact, that the prerogative of the making treaties exists in the crown is its utmost plenitude, and the compacts entered in by the royal authority have the most complete legal validity and perfection independent of any other sanction. The Parliament, it is true, is sometimes seen employing itself in altering the existing laws to conform them to the stipulations in a new treaty, and this may have possibly given birth to the imagination that its cooperation was necessary to the obligatory efficacy of the treaty. But this parliamentary interposition proceeds from a different cause, from the necessity of adjusting a most artificial and intricate system of revenue and commercial laws to the changes made in them by the operation of the treaty, and of adapting new provisions and precautions to the new state of things, to keep the machine from running into disorder. In this respect, therefore, there is no comparison between the intended power of the President and the actual British sovereign. The one can perform alone what the other can do with the concurrence of a branch of the legislature. It must be admitted that in this instance the power of the federal executive would exceed that of any state executive, but this arises naturally from the sovereign power which relates to treaties. If the Confederacy were to be dissolved, it would become a question whether the executive of the several states were not solely invested with that delicate and important prerogative. The president also has to be authorized to receive ambassadors and other public ministries. This, though, has been a rich theme of declamation, is more a matter of dignity than authority. It is a circumstance which will be without consequence in the administration of the government, and it was far more convenient that it should be arranged in this manner than that there should be a necessity for convening the legislature or one of its branches upon every arrival of a foreign minister, though it were merely to take place of a departed predecessor. The president is to nominate, and with the advice and consent of the Senate, to appoint ambassadors and other public ministers, judges of the Supreme Court, in general, all offices of the United States established by law, and whose appointments are not otherwise provided for by the Constitution. The King of Great Britain is emphatically and truly styled the fountain of honor. He not only appoints to all offices, but can create offices. He can confer titles of nobility at pleasure, and has the disposal of an immense number of church performance. There is evidently a great inferiority in the power of the president, in this particular, than that of the British king, nor is it equal to that of the governor of New York. If we are to interact the meaning of this constitution of the state by the practice which has obtained under it, the power of appointment is with us lodged in council composed of the governor of 4 members of the Senate, chosen by the assembly. The governor claims and has frequently exercised the right of nomination and is entitled to a casting a vote in the appointment. If he really has the right of nominating, his authority is to, in this respect, equal to that of the president, and exceeds it in the article of casting a vote. In the national government, if the Senate should be divided, no appointment could be made. In the government of New York, if this council should be divided, the governor can turn the scale and confirm his own nomination. If we were to compare the publicity which must necessarily attend the mode of appointment by the president, an entire branch of the national legislature, with the privacy in the mode of appointment of the governor of New York, closeted in a secret apartment with at most 4 and frequently with only 2 persons, and if we are the same type to consider how much more easy it must be to influence the small number of which councils of appointment consist than that of the considerable number of which the national Senate could consist. We cannot hesitate to pronounce that the power of the chief magistrate of the state in the disposition of offices must in practice be greatly superior than the chief magistrate of the Union. Hence it appears that except as to concurrent authority of the president in the article of treaties, it would be difficult to determine whether the magistrate would, in the aggregate, propose more or less power than the governor of New York, and appeals yet unequivocally that there was no pretense for the parallel which has been attempted between him and the King of Great Britain. But to render the contrast of this, in this respect still more striking, it may be of use to throw principal circumstances of dissimilitude into a closer group. All right. The President of the United States would be an officer elected by the people for 4 years of the King of Great Britain in his... Oh, sorry. I gotta start that over. The President of the United States would be an officer elected by the people for 4 years, and the King of Great Britain in his perpetual and hereditary prince. The one would be amenable to personal punishment and disgrace. The persons of the other is sacred and inviolable. The one would have qualified negative upon the acts of the legislative body, the other as an absolute negative. The one would have a right to command the military and naval forces of the nation, and the other, in addition to this right, possess that of declaring war and of regulating fleets and armies by his own authority. So he's going through this kind of a second time of, hey, The president has actually less authority in these manners than even the governor of New York has in these manners. So it's like, and this is the way it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be kind of a weaker power while people are comparing it to the King of Great Britain. These are the reasons why this power is weaker. The one that would have concurrent power with the branch of the legislature in the formation of treaties, the other is the sole possessor of the power of making treaties. The one would have a like concurrent authority. The other is a sole possessor of making treaties. The one would have a like concurrent authority in appointing offices. The other would have the sole authority of all appointments. The one that can concur no privileges whatsoever, the other can make denizens of aliens, noblemen, commoners, and erect corporations with all the rights and indictment to corporate bodies. The one can prescribe no rules concerning the commerce or currency of the nation. The other is several respects the arbiter of commerce, and in this capacity the establishment of market and fairs, can regulate weights and measures, can lay embargoes for a limited time, coin money, can authorize or prohibit circulation of foreign coin. So this is extremely interesting. So he's still comparing the president to the King of England, and he's saying like, hey, look, the president's not going to has all these powers. These are things the president cannot do. He cannot make rules on the commerce of currency of the nation. He can't tell the mint what to print or what to not. He can't tell what the interest rates are. The other of several respects of the arbiter of commerce in this capacity can establish markets and fairs, can regulate weights and measures, can lay embargoes or tariffs. An embargo is okay. For a limited time, can coin money. The president can't coin new money, can't tell him to print more money, can't tell the Fed to change its interest rates, can't change the... all right. The other is the supreme head of the governor of the national church. What answer shall we give to those who'd persuade us that things so unlike resemble each other, the same that ought to be given of those who tell us that a government, the whole power of which would be in the hands of the elective and periodical servants of the people, is an aristocracy, a monarchy, and a despotism. Publius. All right. All right, so that's number 69. He, he, he. All right, number 70. All right, back on Hamilton, no more John Jay. People to the state of New York. Executive department further considered. All right, so this is going to be a continuation of the same ideas, kind of similar in the last one. There is an idea, which is not without its advocates, that a vigorous executive is inconsistent with the genius of the little r Republican government. The enlightened well-wishers to this species of government must at least hope that the supposition and destitute of foundation, since it can never admit its truth, without the time admitting the commendation of their own principles. Energy in the executive is a leading character in the definition of good government. It is essential to the protection of the community against foreign attacks. It is not less essential than the steady administration of the laws to the protection of property against those irregular and high-handed combinations, which sometimes interrupt the ordinary course of justice, to the security of liberty against the enterprise and assaults of ambition, of faction, and anarchy. Every man, the least conversant in the Roman story, knows how often that a little r republic was obligated to take refuge in the absolute power of a single man, under the formidable title of dictator, as well as against the intrigues of ambitious individuals who aspired to the tyranny and the seditions of whole classes of the community, whose conducts threatened the existence of all government, as against the invasions of external enemies who menaced the conquest and destruction of Rome. There can be no need, however, to multiple arguments or examples on this head. A feeble executive implies a feeble execution of the government. A feeble execution is to be another phrase for a bad execution. and the government ill executed, whatever it may be in theory, must be in practice a bad government. Taking for granted, therefore, that all men of sense will agree in the necessity of an energetic executive, it will only remain to inquire what are the ingredients in which the constitute energy. This argument, read anything on, especially modern day Supreme Court rulings, you'll see this energetic executive pop up repeatedly, and almost every modern fight with the modern executive branch is about this phrasing and what consists of an energetic executive. How far can they be combined with those of other ingredients which constitute safety in their little r Republican sense? How far does this combination characterize the plan which has been reported by the convention? The ingredients which constitute energy in the executive are: first, unity; second, duration; third, adequate provisions for support; and fourth, competent powers. The ingredients which constitute safety in little r Republican sense: first, a due dependence on the people; secondly, a due responsibility. All right, so these are the things that make an executive good, and what make up the energetic executive: unity, duration, adequate provisions, competency, a dependence on the people, and responsibility. Okay. That'd be nice to have at the moment. These politicians and statesmen, who have been the most celebrated for the soundness of their principles or for the justice of their views, have declared in favor of a single executive and a numerous legislature. They have with great propriety considered energy as the most necessary qualification of the former, and regarded this as the most applicable to power in a single hand, while they have with equal propriety considered the latter as best adapted to deliberation and wisdom, and best calculated to consolidate the confidence of the people and secure their privileges and interest. Whew, all right. Now everybody wants to. The unity is conducive to energy will not be disputed. Decision, activity, secrecy, and dispatch will generally characterize the proceedings of one man in a much more eminent degree than the proceedings of a greater number, and in proportion as the number is increased, these qualities will be diminished. This unity may be destroyed in two ways: either by vesting the power into two or more magistrates of equal dignity and authority, or by vesting it ostensibly in one man, subject in whole or in part to the control or cooperation of others, in the capacity of counselors to him. Of the first, the two councils of Rome may serve as an example. Of the last, we shall find examples of the constituents of several of the states. New York, New Jersey, if I recollect right, are the only states which have entrusted the executive authority wholly in one man. Both these methods of destroying the unity of the executive have their partisans, but the Voltaires and the executive councils are the most numerous. They are both liable, if not equal, to similar objections, and may in most lights be examined in conjunction. Thanks for reading. I read equity books in order and learn how to enforce citizens' rights. Oh, that's good. That's awesome, actually. Do you ever do something similar? Stream it. I figured most people, it's hard to read all this stuff just straight out because it can be pretty dry. So I figured it might help some people. I keep trying to drink that drink and it's completely empty. An experience of other nations will afford little instruction on the head. As far, however, it teaches us anything, it teaches us not to be enamored of plurality in the executive. We have seen that the Acadians, on an experiment of two praetors, I guess that was the Acadians' executive, were induced to abolish one. The Roman history records many instances of mischiefs to the republic from the decisions between the consuls and between the military tribunes, who were at times substituted for the consuls. But it gives us no specimens of particular advantages derived to the state from the circumstance of the plurality of those magistrates. That of decisions between them were not mere frequent or more fatal is a matter of astoundment. Until we advert to the single position in which the republic was almost continually placed, and to the prudent policy pointed out by the circumstances of the state and pursued by the councils of making a division of the government between them. The patricians engaged in a particular struggle with the plebeians for the preservation of their ancient authorities and dignities. The councils, who were generally chosen out of the former body, were commonly united by the person's interest they had in the defense and privileges of their order. In addition to this motive of union, after the arms of the republic have considerably expanded to the bounds of empire, it became established custom with the councils to divide the administration between themselves by the lot of the one remaining Rome to govern the city and its environs, the other taking command of the more distant provinces. This expedient must, no doubt, have been great influence to preventing those collisions and rivalships which might otherwise have embroiled the peace of the republic. All right, so he's going through all these historical examples and kind of their modern day examples of why they chose to go with a single executive instead of two. It's like, didn't really work, the rivalship and then the infighting, it didn't work out for this reason and that. All right, that's why we have one executive instead of two. But quitting the dim light of historical research, attaching ourselves purely to the dictates of reason and by good sense, we shall discover much greater cause to reject than to approve the idea of plurality in the executive under any modification whatsoever. Whatever two or more persons are engaged in any common enterprise or pursuit, there is always a danger of difference of opinion. If it be a public trust or office in which they are clothed with equal dignity and authority, there is a particular danger of personal emulation and even animosity from either and especially from all these causes. The most bitter dissensions are apt to spring. Whether these happen any less in the respectability, weaken the authority, and distract the plans and operation of those whom they divide. If they should unfortunately assail to the supreme executive magistracy of the country, consisting a plurality of persons, they might impede or frustrate the most important measures of the government in the most critical emergencies of the state. And what is still worse, they might split the community in the most violent and irrecoverable factions, adhering differently to the different individuals and composed of the magistracy. So they could always see, bad things on the horizon. I don't know if they always did the best of preventing them. Men often oppose a thing merely because they had no agency in planning it, or because it may have been planned by those whom they dislike. But if they had been consulted and have happened to disapprove, opposition then becomes, in their estimation, indispensable duty of self-love. They seem to think themselves bound in honor, and by the motives of personal infallibility, to defeat success of what has been resolved upon the contrary to their sentiments. Men of upright, benevolent tempers have too many opportunities of remarking with horror what desperate lengths of this disposition is sometimes carried, and how often their great interests of society are sacrificed to the vanity, to the consent, and to the obscenity of individuals, who have credit enough to make their passions and their caprices, I don't know how to say that, honestly, interesting to mankind. Perhaps the question now before the public may, in the consequences, afford melancholy proofs of the effects of the despicable frailty and rather detestable vice in human character. Oh, he's going after it. Upon the principles of free government, inconveniences from the source may be mentioned much necessarily to be submitted to the formation of the legislature. but it is unnecessary and therefore unwise to introduce them to the constitution of the executive. All right. It is here, too, that there may be the most pernicious in the legislator. Promptitude of decision is oftener. I wonder if this was just, if this was like, I wonder if that was a phrase back in the day, oftener. An evil than benefit. The difference of opinion and the jarrings of parties in the department of government, though they may sometimes obstruct salutary plans, yet often promote deliberation and circumspection and serve to check the express of the majority. When a resolution, too, is once taken, the opposition must be at an end. That resolution is a law, and the resistance to it is punishable. But no favorable circumstances palliate or atone for the disadvantage and decision in the executive department. Here they are pure and unmixed. There is no point at which they cease to operate. They serve to embarrass and weaken the execution of the plan or measure to which they relate, from the first step to the final. They constantly counteract these qualities in the executive, which are the most necessary ingredients in its composition: vigor and expectation. Not expectation, vigor and expedition, and without any counterbalancing good. In the conduct of war, in which the energy of the executive is to be the bulwark of the national security, everything would be apprehended from its plurality. It must be confused that these observations apply with the principal weight to the first case, supposed, that is, to a plurality of magistrates of equal dignity and authority and scheme, the advocates to which they are not likely to form a numerous sect, but they apply, though not without equal. Yet with the considerable weight to this project of councils, those concurrence is made constitutionally necessary to the operations of the ostensible executive, an artful cabal in that which the council would be able to distract and to innervate the whole system of administration. If no such cabal should exist, the mere diversity of views and opinions would alone be sufficient to tincture and exercise the executive authority with a spirit of habitual feebleness and dilatoriness. Yeah, okay. But one of the weightiest... Oh, I lost my spot. What did I just do? Okay. That's fine. All right, I got it. It must be confessed that these observations apply with principal weight of the first case supposed, that is, to a plurality of magistrates in equal dignity and authority, a scheme, the advocates for which they are not likely to form a numerous sect, but they apply, though not without equal, yet with considerable weight to the project of a council, whose concurrence is made constituently necessary to the operations and ostensible executive. An artful cabal in that council would be able to distract and to invenerate the whole system of administration. If no such cabal should exist, the mere diversity of views and opinions would alone be sufficient to tincture the exercise and executive authority with the spirit of habitual feebleness and dilatoriness. But one of the weightiest objections to the plurality in the executive, which lies a much against the last, that is the first plan, is that it tends to conceal faults and destroy responsibility. Okay, this is actually an interesting argument. We want a strong executive because if they mess up, they can't avoid responsibility. we'll see about that. Responsibility of two kinds is censure and to punishment. The first, the more important of the two, especially in the elective office, man in public trust will much oftener act in such a manner as to render him unworthy of being any longer trusted, than that in such a manner as to make him obnoxious to legal punishment. But the manipulation of the executive adds difficulty of detection in either case. It often becomes impossible among mutual accusations to determine on whom the blame the or punishment of the pernicious measures or series of pernicious measures ought really to fall. It is shifted from one to another with so much dexterity that under such plausible appearances that the public opinion is left in suspense about the real author. The circumstances which they may have led any national miscarriage or misfortune are sometimes so complicated that there are a number of actors who may have a different degrees of kinds of agency. Though we may clearly see upon the whole that there has been a mismanagement, yet it is to be impracticable to pronounce to whose account the evil may have been incurred is truly chargeable. Okay, I think this right here is the best argument that he has made to a singular executive, is that when they mess up, it is the executive's fault. It is the president's fault. It is not the other president's fault. There's not another president. It's not his underlings. It is his fault. He is in charge of the executive. He has the sole authority, and he also has the sole responsibility. I was overruled by my council. The council was so divided in their opinions, these are in quotes, that it was impossible to obtain any better resolution on the point. These and similar pretexts are constantly at hand, whether true or false, and who is there that will either take the trouble or incur the odium of a strict scrutiny into the secret springs of transanction, there would be found a citizen zealous enough to understand the unpromised task. It is, if there happen to be a conclusion between the parties concerned, how easy it is to clothe the circumstances with so much ambiguity as to render it uncertain what was the precise conduct of any of those parties. In the single instance in which the governor of this state, quote, New York, is coupled with a council, that is, in the appointment to offices, we have seen the mischiefs of it, and view now under consideration, scandalous appointments to import officers have been made. Some cases, indeed, have been so flagrant that all parties have agreed in the impropriety of the thing. When inquiry has been made, the blame has been laid by the governor on the members of the councils, who on their part have charged upon his nomination, while the people remain altogether at a loss to determine by whose influence their interest has been committed to the hands of unqualified and so manifestly improper. In tenderness to individuals, I forbear to descend to particulars. All right. Yeah, it's like, so we have these, when we have these councils of the executive, they just all blame each other, and we don't know who's at fault. Public is confused. You could see that certain people in the executive branch try to do this now. Oh, I haven't heard about that. You might have heard some politicians say that recently. A lot. Constantly. It's because they are abdicating their responsibilities. Trying to do the exact thing that Hamilton was talking about. Hold on. Delete all of that. All right. It is evident from the considerations that the plurality of the executive tends to deprive the people of these two greatest securities, that they can have the fateful exercise of any delegated power. First, the restraints of public opinion, which lose their efficacy, as well as on account of the division of the censure attainment on bad measures among a number, as on account the uncertainty of whom it ought to fall, and secondly, opportunity of discovering with facility and clearness the misconduct of the persons they trust, in order either to the removal from office or to their actual punishment in cases which admit of it. in England. All right, so he's going to make a comparison. He loves his comparisons to England government because he's like, oh, we're just so much better. In England, the king's perpetual magistrate and its maxim, which has obtained for the sake of public peace, that he is unaccountable for his administration, and his person sacred. Nothing, therefore, can be wiser in that kingdom than to annex to the king a constitutional council, who may be responsible to the nation for the advice they give. Without this, there would be no responsibility whatsoever in the executive department, an idea inadmissible in a free government. But even there, the king is not bound by the resolutions of his council, though they are answerable to the advice they give. He is an absolute master of his own conduct and to the exercise of his office, and may observe or disregard the counsel given to him at the sole discretion. But in a republic where every magistrate ought to be personally responsible for his behavior in office, the reason which in the British Constitution dictates the propriety of a council not only ceases to apply, but this turns against the institution. In the monarchy of Great Britain, it furnishes a substitute for the prohibited responsibility of the chief magistrate, which serves in some degree as a hostage to the national justice for his good behavior. In the American Republic, it would serve to destroy or would greatly diminish the attendant or necessary responsibility of the chief magistrate himself. The idea of counsel to the executive, which has so generally obtained to the state constitutions, has been derived from that maximum of little r republican jealousy, which considers power as safer in the hands of a number of men than in a single man. If the maximum should be admitted to the applicable to the case, that's a strange word, should be admitted to be applicable to the case. Okay. I should contend that the advantage on the side would be counterbalanced to the numerous disadvantages on the opposite side. I do not think that the rule of at all applicable to the executive power. I clearly concur in opinion in this particular with a writer whom the celebrated Junius pronounced to be deep, solid, ingenious, that the executive power is more easily confined when it is one, that it is far more safe that there should be a single object for the jealousy and watchfulness of the people. In a word, that all multiplication of the executive is rather dangerous than friendly to liberty. A little consideration will satisfy us that the species of security sought in the multiplication of the executive is attainable. Numbers must be so great as to render combination difficult, or they are either a source of danger than of security. The united credit and influence of several individuals must be more formidable to liberty than the credit and influence of either of them separately. When power, therefore, is placed in the hands of so small a number of men as to admit to their interest and views being easily combined in a common enterprise by an artful leader, it becomes more liable to abuse and more dangerous when abused than if it be lodged in the hands of one man who, from the very circumstance of being alone, will be more narrowly watched and more readily suspected than who cannot unite in such a great mass of influence as when he is associated with others. The decemvirs of Rome, whose name denotes the number 3, were more than to be dreaded in their usurpation than any one of them would have been. No person would think of proposing an executive such more numerous than that body. From 6 to a dozen have been suggested for the number of council. The extreme of these numbers is not too great for an easy combination, and such a combination of America would have more to fear than that of ambition of any single individual. A counsel to magistrate, who himself responsible for what he does, are generally nothing better than a clog upon his good intentions, are often the instruments and accomplices of the bad, and are almost always a cloak to his faults. I forbear to dwell upon the subjects of expense, though it be evident that the council should be numerous enough to answer the principal end aimed at this institution. The salaries of the members must be drawn from their homes to reside at the seat of government, would form an item in the catalogue of public expenditures too serious to be incurred for an object equivocal utility. I only add, prior to the appearance in the Constitution, I rarely met with an intelligent man from any of the states who did not admit, as a result of experience, that the unity of the executive of the state was one of the best distinguishing features of our Constitution. Publius. All right. Let's see, it's 130. How many pages is this next one? I was going to really determine if... Okay. I will do one more. This one is only 3 pages. I can do that before I go to sleep. The duration in office of the executive. Okay. I'm going to probably go through this one fast. This has changed in modern times. Although I am kind of curious why they didn't give term limits for the president. At first, duration in office has been mentioned as the second requisite for the energy of the executive authority. It has relation on 2 objects: the personal firmness of the executive magistrate in the employment of the constitutional powers, and to the stability of the system of administration which may have been adopted under his auspices. Auspices? Is that how you say it? I'm not quite sure now. It's okay. With regard to the first, it must be evident that the longer the duration in office, the greater will be the probability of obtaining so important an advantage. It is a general principle of human nature that a man will be interested in whatever he possesses, in the proportion to the firmness or precariousness of the tenure of which he holds it, will be less attached to what he holds by a momentary or uncertain title than to what he enjoys by a durable or certain title, and of course will be willing to risk more for the sake of the one than for the sake of the other. This remark is less applicable to a political privilege or honor or trust than to any article of ordinary property. The inference from it is that a man acting in the capacity of chief magistrate under the consciousness that in a very short time he must lay down his office will be apt to feel himself too little interested in it to hazard any material to censure or perplexity from the independent exertion of his powers, or from encountering the ill humors, however transient, which may happen to prevail, either in a considerable part of the society itself, or even in a predominant faction in the legislative body. It is the case that should only be that if he might lay down, unless he continued by a new choice, and if he should be desired or being continued, his wishes, conspiring with his fears, should tend still more powerfully to corrupt his integrity, or debase his fortitude. In either case, feebleness and irresolution must be the characteristics of the situation. There are some who would be inclined to regard that the servile plenicy of the executive to the prevailing concurrent, either in the community or in the legislature, as its best recommendation. But such men entertain very crude notions, as well as the purpose for which government was instituted, as of the true means by which the public happiness may be promoted. The little r Republican principle demands that the deliberate sense of the community should govern the conduct of those whom they entrust the management of their affairs, but it does not require an unqualified compliance to every sudden breeze of passion, or every transient impulse to which the people may receive from the arts of men, who flatter their prejudices to betray their interests. It is of just observation that the people commonly intend the public good. This often applies to their various errors, but their good sense would despise the adulterer who should pretend that they're always the reason right about the means of promoting it. They know from experience they sometimes err, and they wonder is that they so seldom err as they do, beset as they continually are by the wiles of parasites and sycophants, by the snares of ambition, the avarices, the desperate, and by the artifices of men who possess their confidence more than they deserve it, and of those who seek to possess rather than to deserve it. When occasions present themselves in which the interests of the people are at variance with their inclinations, it is the duty of persons for whom they have appointed to be the guardians of those interests to withstand the temporary delusion in order to give them time and opportunity for more cool and sedate reflection. Instances might be cited in which the conduct of this kind has saved the people from very fatal consequences of their own mistakes, and has procured lasting moments of their gratitude to the men who have courage and magnanimous. I can't even, magnanimous. Itty. Okay. Enough to serve them at the peril of their displeasure. But however inclined we might be to insist upon an unbounded compliance in the executive to the inclinations of the people, we can with no propriety contend for the like compliances to the humors of the legislature. The latter may sometimes stand in opposition to the former, and the other the times the people may entirely neutral. In either supposition, it is clearly desirable that the executive should be in a situation to dare to act in his own opinion with vigor and decision. The same rule which teaches us that the propriety of a proportion between the various branches of power teaches us likewise that this partition ought to be so contrived as to render one independent of the other. To what purpose separate the executive or the judiciary from the legislature? If both of the executive and the judiciary are so constituted as to be at the absolute devotion of the legislature, such a separation must be merely nominal and incapable of producing the ends for which it was established. It is one thing to be subordinate to the laws, and another to be dependent on the legislative body. The first comports with, the last violates, the fundamental principles of good government, and whatever may be the forms of the Constitution, unites all power in the same hands. The tendency of the legislative authority to absorb every other has been fully displayed and illustrated by examples in some preceding numbers. So they were really worried about the legislative branch being the absolute dominant, taking over branch. It's going to put others. That's what a lot of the checks and the balance laws was on the legislative branch. I think they didn't realize that the other branches, the executive and the judiciary, could also take over the government and be the most powerful branch. When in all their writing, they wanted and expected the executive branch to be the most powerful. It did not turn out that way. In governments purely little r Republican, this tendency is almost irresistible. The representatives of the people in popular assemblies seem sometimes to fancy that they are the people themselves, and betray strong symptoms of impatience and disgust at the least sign of opposition from any other quarter, as well if the exercise of its rights. But either the executive or judiciary were a breach of their privilege and their outrage to their dignity. They often appear disposed to exert an imperious control over the other departments. And as they commonly have the people on their side, they always act with such momentum as to make it very difficult for the other members of government to maintain the balance of the Constitution. It may perhaps to be asked how the shortness of the duration in office can affect the independence of the executive on the legislature unless one were possessed of the other power of appointing or displacing the other. One answer to this inquiry may be drawn from the principle already remarked, that is, from the slender interest a man is apt to take in short-lived advantage, and the little inducement it affords him to expose himself on account of it to any considerable inconvenience or hazard. Another answer, perhaps more obvious, though not more conclusive, will result from the consideration of the influence of the legislative body over the people, which might be employed to prevent the re-election of a man who by an upright resistance to any sinister project of that body should have made himself obnoxious to its resentment. Okay. It may be asked also whether a duration of 4 years would answer the end proposed, and if it would not, whether a less period would at least be recommended by a greater security against the ambitious designs. Would not, for that reason, be a preferred to a longer period, which was at the same time too short for the purposes of inspiring and desired firmness and independence of the magistrate? It cannot be affirmed that a duration of 4 years or any other limited duration would completely answer to end proposed. It would start that over. It cannot be affirmed that a duration of 4 years or any other limited duration would completely answer to the end proposed, but it would contribute towards it in a degree which would have material influence upon the spirit and character of the government. Between the commensurate and the termination of such a period, there would always be a considerable interval in which the prospect of annihilation would be sufficiently remote, not to have an improper effect upon the conduct of man, induced with the tolerable portion of fortitude. And if he might reasonably promise himself that there would be a time enough before it arrived to make the community sensible of the property of measures he might be inclined to pursue, though it would be probable that as he approached the moment when the public were, by a new election, to signify their sense of his conduct, his confidence, and with... Just lost my spot. Shit. All right, here we go. Yet both, with the one to the other, would derive support from the opportunities which his previous continuance in the station can afford him, of establishing himself in the esteem of goodwill of his constituents. He might then hazard with safety, in proportion to the proofs he has given of his wisdom and integrity, and to the title which he has acquired to the respect and attachment of his fellow citizens. As, on one hand, the duration of 4 years will contribute to the firmness of the executive in such a sufficient degree as to render it a very valuable ingredient in the composition. So, on the other hand, it is not enough to justify any alarm for the public liberty. If a British House of Commons, from the most feeble beginnings, all caps, from the mere power of assenting or disagreeing with the imposition of a new tax, have by rapid strides reduced the prerogatives of the crown and the privileges of nobility within the limits they are conceived to be compatible with the principles of free government, while they raise themselves to the rank and consequence of co-equal branch of the legislature, if they have been able, in one instance, to abolish both the royalty and the aristocracy, and to overthrow all the ancient establishments, as well as in the church of state, if they have been able on recent occasion to make the monarch tremble at the prospect of innovation, attempt by them, what would be feared from an elective magistrate of 4 years' duration with the confined authorities of the President of the United States? What but have he might be unequal the task which the Constitution assigns him? I shall only add that if his duration be such as to leave the doubts of his firmness, that the doubt is inconsistent with the jealousy of his encroachments. All right, so that was number 71. And it is late for me now, but I will definitely be back next week. Every Tuesday, I do historical documents. If you have any interest in that, I will be continuing on with the Federalist next week. Every once in a while, I jump in on Wednesdays and do a second stream the next day. But if you are interested in that, throw a follow, throw a like, I would love to see anybody back that has any interest in this. All right, everybody have a really good night.